Malcolm Newbury. So I'm from Guildfoss, a business development consulting company. I, together with a number of small to medium-sized enterprises or small companies, startup companies, get together every year to deliver what we call the Open Source Skunkworks. So we've got a fun-filled couple of days in front of you. We've got continuous demonstrations in each of the booths from each of the sponsors. We've got talks for the full 2 days. The program is set out on this chart here. Day 1 on the front, day 2 on the back. And really want to make a statement of a big thanks to our sponsors, NHS England, who are also on the stand. Fantastic job. From O3 Enterprise, who are part of the exhibiting on the other side of that wall there. They do an open source PAX. From Answer Consulting, who are in the corner, they do an open source integration engine and lots of other open source stuff. And he'll be talking later on. Thank you to Answer. Thank you to XML Solutions, who do Forms for Health. Thank you to Brisket, University of Leicester, who do an open source research data management software suite. And thank you to ThinkShield, who do open source observation software. So we've got a great program in front of us. We've also got talks today from NHS England, O3 Enterprise, Open Forum Europe, who've been very successful in lobbying central government, Cabinet Office for the mandation of the open document format standard, which competes with Microsoft Excel and things like that. So that's really cool of them to come along and give us 30 minutes of their time. We've got Janet Edurome, who have got this wonderful system for delivering seamless Wi-Fi login across higher education establishments, and we're hoping that we can also roll that out across the NHS. We've got HSCIC, Health and Social Care Information Centre, who are going to talk about how they've re-engineered our dear beloved NHS spine using open source software. We've got ThinkShield talking. We've got Gwyn Thomas from UK Chip, who's going to talk to us today about how to get the best, safest software without military-grade standards. We've got Tony Shannon, who's going to talk about what he's doing at Leeds University, Leeds Teaching Hospitals. Very, very pro open source camp over there. It's great of him to come along. We've got Marcus Bohr, who's going to talk about, from OpenGPSoc, who's going to talk about his Wi-Fi survey of the NHS. And we've got Adam Roberts of Enigmatic Flare, who's going to talk about development on the Apple Health platform. So that's just today. Really fun-filled program. Right. I'm going to talk about transparency as a business asset. Now, I never like to waste an opportunity like today to talk about something new and what I think is interesting, if a bit risky. So I'm looking for some audience interaction here. And there's going to be a prize because I'm feeling a little bit jaded this morning and worried about the level of participation. There's going to be a prize for the best question, okay? And that is a Skunkworks t-shirt, okay? That's not bad. That's a good. I haven't printed any this year, so this is from last year. It's a very valuable commodity. So anyway, without further ado, let's start. So what is in software? You know, we use stuff every day, and it delivers value for us. Some of it does. But what exactly is inside it, and what exactly does it contain in terms of risk? We all know it contains actually a hell of a lot of stuff. Clinical rules, management information, knowledge, facts, data, website videos, graphics, clinical imaging, you name it, software can deliver it these days, which is reassuring, but also a little bit worrying at the moment, as well, because it's basically moving towards everything we do, goods and services, as a company, as an organization, has some reflection in software. So there's a lot of value in it, and there is, believe it or not, a lot of risk in using it as well. So how do we actually quantify that? How do we actually understand it before we make the purchase? Or if not, then after we make the purchase? So this is the first for me. Transparency is the answer. That's how we get to quantify value and risk. Now, I've never quoted Ronald Reagan before in my life, but actually, this is brilliant. Trust but verify. It's actually an old Russian proverb, which he actually used against them in the 80s when they were claiming, certain levels of nuclear disarmament, and he was wanting a whole series of verification activities to take place. And they were resisting. But trust but verify is basically, the underlying principle behind using transparency to account for value and data. And what better transparency could you get in the software world, of course, but open source software? So let's have a look at the value chain for software in both software providers, trusts, and the open source community. So how is value being delivered here? Who's doing what and delivering what to who, and what do they get out of it? Well, we've got three chains here. We've got software providers on the left, NHS trusts in the middle, and the open source community on the right. Now, they look fairly similar in what they're doing, but actually they're doing very different things for different reasons. The software provider is working with a lot of other third-party software providers and the OSS community and in addition doing their own development and bundling to produce their own supplier software assets from which they derive profit, with some risk and in order to deliver company value. Their key interest here is profit, and there's nothing wrong with that. On the right-hand side, we have the open source community. Now, their interests are totally different. However, they have a similar sort of value chain. They're working with open source components only to produce open source software and produce open source assets. What exactly is an open source asset? What they get out of it is utility. What they're aiming to get out of it is utility, but they do so with some risk. What is that risk? And they're doing it in order to sustain the community. The trusts, on the other hand, in the middle, use third-party software and increasingly open source software. They integrate and customize the software for their own purposes. And yes, they do find their way into NHS assets. Their key interest is in delivering service with risk and to avoid any kind of surplus or loss at the end of the year. So that's basically how the supply chain works. But how does open source play into this? After all, it's a free resource. It's a free asset. So, actually, you account for open source software, or you should account for open source software. Bear in mind, this is meant to be a discussion chat, so raise questions whenever you like. It should be treated like any other software. The purchase value is zero, but the basic principles are the same. So all customization and integration costs for the software should be capitalized and amortized from the go-live date of the software. Now, that doesn't entitle any organization to say, right, I've got some open source software, therefore I'm going to classify it as an asset. But actually, when you integrate it into your organization and serve it to service the people and staff in your organization, it's an asset. And it should be valued as such. So, a fair value for the software, I think, and I think an accountant would say the same thing, is that, well, you should take a look at the value of an equivalent proprietary software package and assign that value to the open source package. What's wrong with that? The market decides the value of the proprietary software, and given that the open source software replaces proprietary software, then clearly inside that organization which is using it, it has the same value. So So all support costs, of course, support contract costs would be OPEX. So you couldn't classify those as capital. But so, I mean, the question is it possible for trusts to increase the value of their capital assets, even though they're acquiring free software from the open source community? I mean, it sounds too good to be true, doesn't it? But actually, you've got to think about it, because there's a lot of effort going into making that software work for the organization, and therefore releasing the value, the inherent value that we all know is there within open source, into that organization. I think we have to look at that very carefully. So let's look at the three elements of the supply chain and SMEs. Why do SME developers love working with open source? Three key reasons, really. Marketing is done for you through the open source communities, which continually chat and swap contacts, and client contacts also contribute to those communities. So marketing is easier. Lower scaling up costs. Clearly, if it's open source, the legal terms are nearly always the same or similar, and fall into a number of set categories. You can self-evaluate as a developer, self-train. You can skill up, without any cost. The only cost is your time, basically, which some developers have a lot of. Some developers have a lot of. But and of course, being part of that community provides you with a wider inspiration for any innovation, new ideas. So developers love working with open source communities. On the downside, of course, there has to be a heavier focus for them on customer value, on delivering customer value, because there's more competition for the same skills. And there's a higher overhead. In fact, you've got to participate in these communities in order to get attention and in order for these communities to swap knowledge with those individuals. And so, and how does open source supply affect the supplier, the providers of software? So let's take, for example, a supplier who's got a proprietary package which he wants to make open source. So what are the positive things that are going to happen and the negative things that are going to happen? Well, the first thing is, of course, if we open source, I mean, I've been through this with my old company, Sun, of course, is you've got lower operational expenditures because you don't have to worry about legal terms because it's the same. The users that you traditionally had to train up or at least do a lot of pre-sales work with can qualify themselves into the sales process by downloading and installing it and using the software themselves. There's community-driven innovation, so you don't really need to worry too much about that either, or you can get a lot of help from the community. And you get lower day rate development costs because, of course, the people with the skills in your product, there are lots more of them in the community to call on, so there's more competition. There's also potential for a capital expenditure write-off because you did have a proprietary asset on the books in terms of your software, which you've now open sourced. So actually, that's a potentially huge benefit for that company if it can just write off a lot of capital expenditure there. So potentially quite a large benefit there as well. And of course, they'll be switching from a license model to an open source SaaS model where they'll be offering their clients subscriptions instead of licenses. So there shouldn't be too much of a difference in terms of what they see in terms of revenue. It just comes in via a different route. And there'll be lots more opportunities for attached revenue. So partnerships with hardware companies, with other software companies. Yeah, I mean, it gets them thinking in a different space, as opposed to, what's the next feature we're going to add to our product? Yeah, and of course, open sourcing does improve your presence in the market, and your brand as such gets bigger. So ultimately, that's going to have a positive effect on the value of your company. On the negative side, it's losing the old comfort blanket of licenses that have to be sold, and the well-known, well-trodden software license model. That's, for some companies, very difficult to let go of. There'll be lower service margins for them as well because of that competition we mentioned earlier on, of course. That's going to affect their revenue streams for the consulting and professional services, as well as for their developers. And there'll be higher management costs because moving a product into open source, as we mentioned earlier on, there's risk in open source software as well as value, and you're potentially exposing a lot of people to that risk by open sourcing it. So you have to look at licensing, making sure that the proper disclaimers in the choosing the right license, but also if there's, you really have to look at all the potential risks that could emanate from your software. I think this has come up recently in Birmingham's e-prescribing software. They were kind of reluctant to let that go into open source because they were afraid of what people might do with it. So these things have to be addressed, and they can't be ignored, is what I'm saying. So that's higher overhead. And what does open source do for trusts? Well, I think, as we talked earlier, I think there's an immediate capital asset gain. Once the software goes live and is integrated into the enterprise, I think we've got to get the accountants to recognize that as a positive asset for the trust, because actually higher capital assets are not a bad thing for trusts, because that allows them to borrow more money ultimately from non-government sources. So I think that's an interesting thing to look into. There will be more competition in supply, of course, for support services and development services. So that's a great thing for trusts. And also, there'll be more control for them in the open source package than there would be for a closed source package, because, of course, they can modify the software if they want to. They can train as many people up as they want to. There will be training courses on offer, of course, but they don't have to take them. There's always a competitive option with open source. And, of course, they can use, like the suppliers, the community as a source for innovation and solutions to problems which are particular to them. Negative side, again, I think there is a higher risk, certainly a perceived higher risk of using open source. So there is higher overhead of asset ownership as well. These, taking on an open source package into the organization is asset ownership. It's not renting. It's not leasing a product. You own it. So you have to figure out, a strategy for managing the risk around that. And there is also the perception of reduced security. Again, this comes back to the trust working with the community to address those risks. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to have to skip to near the end. I think there's a virtuous circle here. I think we've got happy developers, happy software suppliers, and trusts. But in order to make that virtual circle work, I think we've got to get the accountants involved to properly account for the value and risk in open source software. I'm going to skip through the risks. I think if we don't manage the risks, we could fall victim to the hype cycle. I think open source software, some of the packages are way over to the right of the chart. So they're very mature. They've been in the market for some of them 10 years or more. And their user base is growing. Open standards, are very close behind. The use of DICOM, for instance, in PAX has been around for well over 10 years. New things like open data, I think we're towards the left of the hype cycle, and I think, as we've seen from the press, we've got some issues there. So there's big numbers here. Big numbers. If we account for open source properly, if you just take a small package, a 50K license, which I was involved in selling a while back to about 100 trusts, you scale that up. If we account for those assets, those open source assets properly, that's £5 million you're talking about, and just for a tiny, tiny piece of software. If you look at something like an EPR license, which is over $1 million, that's a lot of money that we're not accounting for on the balance sheets of our trusts today. So, and it does make the 20 million that's been allocated by NHS England peanuts. When you start thinking of the numbers here that we're ignoring by not accounting for open source software. So that's the end of my talk. I'm going to hand over now to Marcus, who's going to introduce the next speaker. All right, cheers.